Hi, Kelly. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well today. Thank you.
Good. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into philosophy.
Sure. I got into philosophy the way I think a lot of people do, just sort of asking big questions, having big curiosities. I was lucky because I went to a high school where they had this IB International Baccalaureate program, and I wasn't in it, but the capstone for that whole thing was a course called Theory of Knowledge. And I thought that sounded really great, and I wanted to get in, and luckily they let me in. And so that was sort of my first contact with academic Western sort of analytic philosophy, and I liked it. And then I picked it as my major in undergrad.
That's actually really interesting you say that because I did the International Baccalaureate program and I took Theory of Knowledge also at my high school. And I think that that was probably my first contact with philosophy as well.
Yeah,
So,
I was so excited to be there. Like, I'm sure you understand. Lots of the IB kids in their senior year, very stressed out, lots of homework. I think a lot of them weren't enjoying the course as much as I was, since it was just my little thing I could focus on.
yeah, definitely. I think a lot of us were like really just trying to get in our final papers and things like that because like for the IB program, you have to have like a culminating paper for each of your classes. And then for the actual program itself, you have like a 20-page paper. So yeah. Okay. So um, how did you get into von Frisch? And then like, how do you think the perception of him as an exemplar changes the way in which we view his work?
Yeah, I got into von Frisch uh, first by getting into insects. So I started my PhD at Arizona State University Center for Biology and Society, and it's a real sort of practice oriented place where like the details of scientific practice really matter. And so I was thinking, what kind of group of scientists can I get to know so I can see a sort of insider's perspective on it all? And ASU had this great, they still have this great social insect research group called Surge. And so I started talking with all these social insect researchers. Lots of them are German. They turned me onto some literature that I like. And then I start sort of looking at all these contemporary social insect researchers I'm interested in, and I wonder where they came from. And so I start looking into lineages of mentors and mentees, and I see that a lot of it traces back to von Frisch, the Austrian ethologist. Had his career sort of at the beginning and middle of the 20th century. And this thing about him being an exemplar for the discipline of ethology, that was an idea that I had because I was noticing a whole lot of affinities between von Frisch's early career research, his sort of approach to animals, and classical ethology, which is sort of the discipline of ethology prior to World War II, is a quick way to say it. So I was developing this idea that he was he's sort of a forgotten exemplar for this early stage of the discipline of ethology. And Richard Burkhardt has actually recently been talking with me about this idea. And he has shown me that despite these affinities that I've noted, Tinbergen and Lorenz, the two figureheads of ethology, they really didn't treat von Frisch as an exemplar in the way that you'd expect. So my thinking on this has sort of developed since then, where von Frisch, not an exemplar for early ethology, but lots of commonalities. And I think when we start looking at von Frisch relative to the discipline of ethology, it points our attention towards a sort of understudied, or I don't know, more peripheral version of ethology, which is this German-speaking tradition that comes out of von Frisch, goes largely through Martin Lindauer, and then today there's a whole lot of German-speaking social insect researchers at major research universities, and they're doing really cool stuff. So I guess that's sort of how it all comes together for me right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you have a forthcoming journal article in Biology and Philosophy entitled "What Makes Neurophysiology Meaningful? Semantic Content in Insect Navigation Research." So just would you give us like kind of an overview of the paper, first of all?
Yeah. So I'm interested in the social insect research. One of the things, or the thing that really got me interested is their use of, I call them intentional concepts or representational concepts. So they'll have a hypothesis like an ant gathers information about how far it's walked through, mechanism X. And then they'll do some behavioral experiments with ants. And at the end of the experiments, they interpret the results. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, the results support the hypothesis. This ant is getting information about Y through mechanism X. And representational concepts like that, information about, semantic content is like a philosophically fraught thing that has a huge history. Philosophers want to know how one thing can be about another thing, like what that relationship is. And so in this paper, I took a sort of, I think, a different approach than a lot of philosophers of science have taken, where instead of sort of looking to the science to give me mechanistic facts about biology that I'll then interpret as the philosopher and sort of judge, yes, this is real representation, or no, this is like a metaphor that scientists use or something. Instead of doing that, what I decided to do was look at the way scientists justify their claims about representational content. So like, what are the actions, the experiments they design? What sorts of habits of reasoning do they use when they interpret the results of those experiments? And how do these ascriptions of representational content sort of figure into the longer trajectory of an entire research program? Like not just one experiment, but decades of them sort of pursuing certain epistemic aims. And how do these ascriptions of representational content figure into that, if they figure in at all? So the paper looks at that. The conclusion is the ascriptions of representational content are a productive sort of thing scientists do. They help them formulate hypotheses. They help them engage in comparative theorizing. And the way they justify their ascriptions of representational content really incorporates this notion of goal-directed function, which is kind of interesting because there's this long debate in the philosophy of biology on representational content, where a lot of philosophers have thought that an ideological, sort of like more historical idea of biological function is behind researchers' ascriptions of representational content. And when I was looking at these experiments, I think it's more of a goal-directed notion of biological function.
Could you give an example of that you studied, perhaps, like something specific that might help anyone in the audience who's a little bit lost?
Yeah. So I look at this experiment where researchers have an ant colony, and the ants leave to go to a feeding station. Then the ants bring back some food. So they train the ants to get used to that, doing that sort of foraging. And then what happens is the ants will walk out, get the food, then the researchers grab them and they'll cut their legs in half, or they'll glue stilts onto their legs. So now an ant who has stilts on his legs, his steps are covering more distance. Per step, he's moving more. And the ant who has his legs shortened, he's moving less distance per step now. Or I should say it's a foraging ant. She's moving less distance per step. And when they did that, they found that the ants who had the short legs, they always undercut their return journey to the nest. So like they never go far enough. And the ants who have stilts on their legs, they're always overshooting the nest. Like they think it's farther away than it really is, they think. And so that's part of the experiment that justified the claim that ants get information about how far they've walked by counting their steps. So they sort of like have an internal odometer.
Okay, yeah.
There's the ascription of representational content I'm interested in. And then there's the experiment that justified it. And in the paper, I sort of like zoom in on this experiment and show how goal-directed biological function is really what these researchers are investigating, as opposed to ideological function.
Yeah, no, that's great. And then just to clarify, when you say goal-directed versus ideological, what specifically do you mean by that?
Yeah, there's in the function literature is huge. One sort of flavor of biological function. So, I mean, I guess I should start with the fact that there are functions in biology, sort of like a woodpecker's beak. It's for putting some holes in wood, you know, feet are for standing on. There's lots of things have functions. And then the philosophical question is, what are they? Where do they come from? And an ideological theory of biological function says that the function of something, to determine what it is, you have to look to the past. You have to look to, often they bring in like evolutionary theory. So you have to look at natural selection and you have to see what the trait was selected for. And when you know what the trait was selected for, the reason why it's still around, maybe, then you know what its function is. And that's a really popular way of thinking about biological function. And then so contrast that with goal-directed function, which is more of a who call it cybernetic or maybe like mechanical way of thinking about function, where if you want to find out what something's function is, you have to look at the way it behaves across a like set of situations. And the example they always give is a heat-seeking missile. So it's like a heat-seeking missile, its function is to home towards some source of heat. Well, how do you know it has that function? Because in a whole variety of situations, like no matter where we put the missile when we ignite it, it will always go towards that one hot point. And so when you like look at all the situations and you look at the outcomes of all the situations, and they're all the missile hitting this hot thing, that's how you know that the missile has the function of homing towards heat. And so what I'm showing is that the way they set up these experiments with putting ants on stilts and stumps, it sort of conforms to this goal-directed way of thinking about function more than it, because I mean, if they were using an ideological notion of function to justify these ascriptions, we would expect them to be looking into the past or something, to be like, how did past ants get home from their foraging trips?
Right. No, that's a very helpful clarification. So moving on a little bit. So a lot of your publications seem to focus on insects, their social behavior, evolution, and reproductive behaviors. So how exactly did you get interested in these subjects, like specifically? Because I know that philosophy of science is such a large umbrella. So I was interested.
Yeah. I came to grad school with an interest in meaning. So like this representational content, that's sort of whole category of concepts, and then behavior. And I wanted to do something that combined those two things, like brains and behavior, representation and meaning. And so it was sort of what I was talking about earlier, where I showed up at ASU Center for Biology and Society, and I was starting to try to find some sort of scientific community to get into and pick the little area of science that I was going to try and become an expert in. And I've always liked insects, especially ants and bees. I sort of had an interest coming in. And then I decided to go all the way with it when the social insect researchers were nice to me. They sort of, wanted to talk to me about philosophy things, and had to go into their lab meetings or maybe take an individual reading course with one of them.
Yeah, I think a lot of philosophers that I've talked to, their current concentrations are influenced a lot in part by what people were concentrating on in the department that they were in, that were friendly or very interesting or open to research with them. So
Yeah, and
sorry, go on.
since I picked it, it's been great. I've learned all these things I didn't know about why insects are such a special, especially social insects, are such a special organism to do behavioral research on. A lot of special properties.
Is there a reason you specifically pick insects over, say, other animals like cats, dogs, or mammals?
Yeah, my thinking was that there's going to be just like the tightest experiments here for a variety of reasons. And one of them is sort of ethical. There's no real limit to like what you can do with ants and honeybees when you design experiments. And there's a whole lot of ethical considerations if you're going to do sort of behavioral experiments with dogs, for instance. So these social insect researchers are sort of like free to do a lot of things. The animals are so small that matters a lot for navigation research, because sort of when a migratory bird goes a long distance, that's a long distance to us too. It can be over continents. It's like a real feat to track them. But when these insects go and travel a long distance, relative to us, it's not quite as far, and you can sort of design experiments that are at the same time outdoors in sort of more natural conditions, but also where you can exert control over the situation, sort of be everywhere.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and definitely answers a lot of questions. Like, it seems like they're easier to experiment on, both like just logistically speaking with the smaller distances they cover, and also there's less hoops to jump through, ethically speaking. So according to your website, so moving off of your research and more onto your side academia projects, it looks like you've done a lot of work volunteering, and like specifically I've gotten involved in outreach programs like the Embryo Project, Ask a Biologist program, and the ASU Prison Biology Education program. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about these programs, or what you got interested, or how you got interested in them outside of philosophy?
Yeah, sure. So I am Navajo from the Dene tribe. So I've always sort of, coming into analytic philosophy, just super white discipline, I've sort of been thinking about underrepresented scholars and problems around that for a while. And when I first started grad school, I won a Ford Foundation fellowship, and that sort of freed me up to, be able to pursue some of the side projects you just listed, like the prison biology education one. I really, when I was at ASU, became a senior member volunteering with them. It's a great program. It's still going on. I think it's really important to provide those kinds of services and to sort of cultivate the curiosity of people who are in that situation, who are incarcerated. Most of them are set to come out sometime. You're gonna lock people away in a cage and then not give them anything positive. It's not good. So yeah, I'd like to get into actually more prison education volunteering, as I hopefully stay in academia. Some of the other ones I really liked, you listed Embryo Project. That's great. It's an online open access resource for information about the history of biology, especially reproductive biology. That's sort of Jane Mayenschein's thing over at Arizona State. That's how I got involved with it. Yeah, Ask a Biologist is a great program too. It's also through ASU. K through 12 students will send me questions. They send out Dr. Biology, I think the name is, questions. And then Dr. Biology chooses different people at ASU depending on their expertise area. So I get the sort of like, philosophical, I don't know, abstract, kind of like weird questions that kids send in.
Do you have any favorite questions? That sounds like such a cool program to be a part of.
Yeah, I do have a favorite question. One student asked, in biology, are there questions you can't answer?
Okay, that's a really good one.
And so I had to think, yeah, it's a fun question. You think about it, and I was like, yeah, there are definitely questions biologists can't answer, but it's interesting to think about why they can't answer. And there's like different reasons. Some of them might have to do with our like fundamental limits as human beings and our sort of epistemic and cognitive abilities. Some of them have to do with like, that we just don't have, the facts are gone or the evidence is gone. Like, what color was a certain dinosaur? If we really want to know for sure, it's kind of hard to think about, like, maybe we could figure out down the line, but I don't know right now.
Yeah, it seems like it would be near impossible, even if we could get like the colors of the dinosaurs, to get the specific hue right, or like the very minute details of different scientific endeavors. Correct. So speaking of giving advice to other people, do you have any advice for undergrads listening? So either about academia writing, publishing, or just any general life advice?
Yeah, in general life advice, not so much. I've been studying philosophy for a while, and that's not, you know, the most practical career-wise choice, a lot of people would say. So
Yeah, tell me about it.
I'm not going to give any advice on that front. But from a more sort of, passions and interests, intellectual things type area, I'd say that don't worry if you feel like your interests are too varied, or it's like you're just all over the place, and that like you need to pick something to be a real expert in, because I really believe that everything has to do with everything. And whether it's 16th century wood carving, or the way animals see polarized light, or films from the 1950s, anything that you get really interested in and you start to learn a lot about, it's all going to come back around and start hooking up with each other. And that's how you develop a worthwhile perspective on things, that you can bring novel insights to whatever problems you're interested in.
Yeah, that's great advice, especially because I know how difficult it is for undergrads to choose a major or to stick with that major and then to figure out within that major what they want to focus on. So that was really great advice there. And then within writing, do you have any like things that you tend to like challenge or face that are more difficult for you in the writing process that maybe you have advice for, or maybe you don't? Maybe it's just something that, a lot of people struggle with that you want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a draft right now of a paper, so it's all fresh to me. The problem I have with not being able to write a sentence that is just good enough for now. If you know what I mean here, though. Like I wish I didn't do this, but when I come to a paper, I'm like, all right, time to start at the beginning in the introduction, and then I start writing. And I'm like, oh, it's not very good, and I want it all to be good the first time through, top to bottom, and that's just not like a realistic way to really go about writing these manuscripts. So eventually,
Definitely.
I get okay, now it's time for this section, or that's not written exactly the way it's going to be in the final publication, but that's all right because it got my ideas down for now. I have trouble sort of just leaving things be and then getting back to it.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. So, what exactly are you working on now? Speaking of your draft.
I'm working on a paper about the cognitive map debate. So in the late 1940s, this hypothesis comes out that rats navigate by means of a cognitive map. And this sort of story reaches its big peak in 2014. Some researchers get the Nobel Prize in medicine or physiology for discovering the neurocellular basis of this cognitive map that was hypothesized back in the late 40s. And it's just a really interesting literature, because on the one hand, some people think this is like the holy grail, one of the holy grails of cognition research. It's like a trait that we're going to be able to find in lots of animals and that we have really great research on. Other researchers think that it's sort of an unwarranted anthropomorphic metaphor. It's not a big deal really, and we should stop using the term. And the debate's really blown up in insects. So that's sort of how I learned about it. Ant and honeybee researchers have been fighting for, I don't know, I suppose 3 decades at least now, about whether or not honeybees have a cognitive map. And so I'm sort of bringing a historical perspective to this debate, showing where it came from and how its past affects the way it is now. And then hopefully going to draw out some philosophical conclusions also from that.
Yeah, that sounds great. I definitely look forward to hearing about that. So I think that concludes all of my questions for today, but it was really great getting to interview you, and I really appreciate you giving us the time. So
yeah, I appreciate the time too. Thanks for conducting this.
of course, yeah. All right, well, I'll see you later.
All right.